When I was a boy, my father used to say to me, there are three things that matter. We'd often have, those fatherly son chats. And he'd say to me, you need to be physically active. And we'd often talk about, what that meant. Now, in the early days when I was a teenager in particular, that was never a problem because I was very active. I played lots of sports and so on. But my dad would always say, three things that matter, son. First one, you've got to be physically active. He'd say, now the second one is you've got to be mentally alert. You've got to keep the brain ticking over. And even though you might work with your hands, you've got to keep the brain going. And then Dad was big on the third one, and he'd say, you've got to be spiritually alive. Now, my parents, they were big in the Christian tradition. I kind of changed later on. I'm not a religious person. I have great respect for you if you are. But I do believe that every human being is a spiritual being. There are things of the soul that really matter. And my dad, bless him, that was his lesson when I was a kid. You've got to be physically active, you've got to be mentally alert, and you have to be spiritually alive. And it was a great grounding as I started to go through those, I think my mother used to say, it's the terrible teens. I overheard my mother saying to one of her friends one time, she said, you don't know you're alive, and you'll never criticise another person's children when you've had boys of your own. And it's fair to say, my brother and I, we weren't the best behaved boys. But Dad kept reinforcing physically fit, mentally alert, spiritually alive. And I never forgot them. And as I became an adult myself and I started to explore in the early days of my own management career, and I started to explore things and learn about things myself, I added two more to this equation. And I now call it a human being fully alive. Because I believe my father is right. You need to be physically active. You need to be mentally alert. You need to be spiritually alive, but what I added was emotionally healthy to the equation. And I also added universally aware. So five things, three from my father to be a human being fully alive. From Dad, it's about being physically active, it's about being mentally alert, it's about being spiritually alive. And in my experience over the years, I've added two more, emotionally healthy and universally aware. And I wonder about you in your leadership and in your personal life, how much alive are you? When you got up this morning, did you feel really alive? Did you jump out of bed as though this day was your last? Because that's how I live my life. I get up every morning, and regardless of, how I might feel, once my feet hit the floor, my attitude is, I'm going to give this day my best shot. I'm not going to die wondering. And what's helped me over the years is to remember, you've got to be physically active. I try and walk a lot most days. I don't do as much exercise as I once used to do, but I try and walk every day because I know walking's good not just for your physical being, but it's also good for lots of other things. I try to keep my mind sharp. I try to read something every day. I try to look at something every day that I haven't looked at before. I try and expand my thinking. I try and have my thinking challenged so that I'm always alert, because that keeps the brain, ticking over as well. And I try and think about at least 2 or 3 times a day things of the soul. I often sit under a tree somewhere and reflect. And I think about being emotionally healthy as well. And that was the first one I added to my father's equation, because my dad wasn't really good emotionally. And he and I used to war a lot about this. My father used to say to me, because I was quite an emotional boy at one stage of my life, and Dad would say, if I see you snivelling, I'll take you within an inch of your life. This is what he'd tell me. It was a bit different in those days. You know, you weren't allowed to show emotions. And what I learnt, when my father was a boy, his father was at the war. And so my father's generation, a lot of them had no role models. Any wonder they weren't able to express their emotions. They were just completely shut down. So I forgave my dad in the end. But I've since learnt, you blokes in the room, you've got to get good at sharing your feelings. I don't think intuition is a female gift. I just think that most women are more advanced than us blokes. But we've got to learn, fellas, to talk about how we feel. It's very important in the workplace to recognise how people are feeling and to talk about feelings, because feelings have a lot to do with high performance. This is why Usain Bolt is so good. Because in the moment, it's about a feeling. And his pre-warm-up and race routine, if you've seen him, it's all about feeling good, because he knows that if he feels well, he's going to run well. And I know from working with organisations for a long time, that people who feel well perform well. I know that people who are physically active perform well. I know that people who are mentally alert perform well. I know that people who are spiritually alive perform well. And I know that people who are emotionally healthy perform well. I also know that people who are universally aware perform well. You know, you've got to understand the world. And if you can, you've got to get out and see the world beyond your back door, beyond your own community, beyond your own city. I mean, I've been fortunate, I've been to more than 40 countries. And it always keeps me aware, you know, there's differences out there that are really important. Reminds me of my own uniqueness as well as the uniqueness of every other person that we come and meet. So, are you a human being fully alive? Just take a moment, check in, read what's on the screen, and just ask yourself, am I as fully alive as I could be?